As the seconds tick away towards Columbia's second blast-off, the astronauts will be preparing for what's easily the most dangerous part of the whole mission. And this time there'll be a lot more tension in Cape Canaveral's launch control than on the first flight, when everything seemed to be going fine. It was only later, when this film and the instruments were studied, that it was realized Columbia had come very near to disaster moments after launch. The enormous blast from the two solid rockets on each side of Columbia was 4 times more powerful than expected. The blast bounced off the launch pad and damaged the supports for Columbia's maneuvering engines, as well as knocking off some of those famous tires. To make sure Columbia isn't put in such danger this time, extra safety precautions have been taken. As Columbia leaves the pad, huge jets of water, spraying 1,000 gallons a second, will be aimed directly under the flames to stop the blast bouncing back. But once clear of the tower, Columbia rolls gracefully round so that the rockets can be safely jettisoned. That's a tricky operation, but nothing to the great danger of those first few seconds after the launch.
Reg Turner reporting for News Round from Mission Control. And we hope to be bringing you the latest news of Columbia's flight as it happens, including live coverage of the return to Earth in a News Round special next Monday. But for now, bye-bye.
Pad 39A at the Kennedy Space Center, and the Columbia's been here before. But this time the countdown is much smoother. The spacecraft was loaded this morning with liquid hydrogen and oxygen, and no problems at all were reported, except with the weather. A 10-knot crosswind that, if it persists, could cause Wednesday's launch to be postponed.
We can stand quite a lot of wind actually out at the pad. Where we have a problem is at the landing sites. If we should have to come back, we can have no more than about 10 or 15 knot winds, crosswinds on the runway.
And some of the other contingencies are being guarded against too. In the event of a return to launch site or landing on water, Space Agency and Air Force teams have been practicing their rescue routines on a mock-up of the Columbia's flight deck. There's every confidence, however, that none of this will be needed. Martin Bell, BBC, Cape Canaveral.
A life-size mock-up of the shuttle cockpit has provided training for the two astronauts. And in particular, they've learned how to use this. In space jargon, it's the Payload Deployment and Retrieval System. In Earthbound language, it's a remote-controlled arm. It's 50 feet long, has an elbow, wrist and hand, and will ultimately be used to place satellites in orbit. And this is where the astronauts will control the mechanical arm from. They can control all its movements, and from here, they can control the two cameras on the arm, one on the wrist and one on the elbow. The flight deck is, as before, no bigger than on a jumbo jet, but with at least one big difference. Pull this, the roof blows out and the pilot ejects. If 2 or 3 engines fail in the first stage of the flight, then the crew ejects and the spacecraft is lost. If one engine goes at this stage, the crew jettison the fuel tank and bring the shuttle back to the launch site. If one engine goes in orbit, the shuttle can still be brought back to the western United States. And if more than one engine fails in orbit, well, that's the unthinkable. Assuming none of that comes true, Joe Engel will open the airlock compartment, enter it and put on his spacesuit to test it. This is astronaut Dan Brandenstein, a member of the backup team who will be talking to the two men during the flight.
Beyond that door is outer space.
Ultimately, though not on this flight, the astronauts will move outside the shuttle as America moves that much nearer to harnessing space.
Hello again, and first tonight we go to America, where everything is fine for tomorrow's launch of the Space Shuttle Columbia, apart, that is, from the weather. There have been no technical hitches. Scientists say the countdown couldn't be going better. But high winds and heavy rain are battering the launch site at Cape Canaveral, and unless conditions get better, liftoff for Columbia's second trip into space might have to be postponed. A final decision will be made by first thing tomorrow morning, our time. The two astronauts, Joe Engel and Richard Truly, arrived at Cape Canaveral yesterday looking happy and hopeful. Today they've been to briefing sessions and they'll be in bed by 5:30, ready for an early start in the morning.
We're mighty glad that we're getting this close to flying, and Dick and I are both anxious. We've been looking forward to it for a long time, and we're ready to go. We're going to tune up and polish up tomorrow out on with the STA out on the strip, and then day after tomorrow we're going to do the real thing.
Or so they hope. The storm clouds are still gathering around the Cape. The weather is the one thing that space scientists can't control, and the storms could make things just too dangerous for the crew. From the Cape, Newsround space editor Reg Turnhill takes up the story.
After months of drought and a serious water shortage, rainstorms have been sweeping across the Cape here. And Engel and Truly, one of whose jobs is to do weather research by counting lightning flashes during their 83 trips around the world, may see more lightning than they want to at liftoff time, for then it could be very dangerous. And there's danger here too for us watchers, because on the first flight they found that those solid rocket boosters rained acid down upon us after the launch. So we've all been told to buy 10-pound car covers so the acid rain won't spoil the paint. And all the spectators, except for newsmen, have been moved much further back because the acid rain could give you a nasty rash or even get in the eyes. But a NASA spokesman told me that we must take our chance. Space correspondents, he said, are like war correspondents. They're expendable. Reg Turnhill for Newsround from Cape Canaveral.
The scene changed overnight. The service structure around the Columbia was swung back, leaving the spaceship freestanding on the launch pad, except for the access ramp and the arm over the tip of the big tank. A long hold in the countdown lasts till late tonight. Then early tomorrow, the tank will be fueled, the final countdown will begin, and the Columbia will be ready for its crew.
We're mighty glad that we're getting this close to flying, and Dick and I are both anxious. We've been looking forward to it for a long time, and we're ready to go. We're going to tune up and polish up tomorrow out on with the STA out on the strip, and then day after tomorrow we're going to do the real thing.
The STA is the shuttle training aircraft, a Gulfstream jet modified to simulate the cockpit conditions of the Columbia. The astronauts were out early this morning doing touch-and-go landings in the event of an emergency return to the launch site. But if today's weather persists, heavy cloud cover and rain showers, they know there'll be no liftoff on schedule tomorrow. They and NASA officials can only wait and hope.
The weatherman has been telling us it's going to get better, but I guess I'm like you, I haven't seen that yet. But hopefully they're still saying in the morning it should be better. At least the winds have died down.
The space agency people, who have a talent for turning the poetic into the prosaic, are enjoying what they call a zero-problem countdown. The spacecraft is predictable, but the weather is not, and the only anxiety is about the wind and the clouds. Martin Bell, BBC, Cape Canaveral.
The shuttle now stands free. The superstructure has been inched back, leaving just the fueling pipes at the top and the astronauts' bridge below. On either side of it, the solid rocket boosters, which will lift it off the launch pad before dropping away, and behind it, the fuel tank, which pushes it into space. Then it too falls away, and the shuttle is on its own. On its own with just 3 main engines. One has a thrust of nearly 1 million pounds, which is more power than either of these astronauts has sat on before, and a lot more power than these 2 Gulfstream jets have. But they're rather special jets. Each has a flight deck modified on the captain's side to resemble the shuttle deck. And the 2 astronauts, each with a backup team, are about to go up again for more practice. The commander, Joe Engel, has flown at a height of 50 miles before, which is technically space, though he has not been in orbit. But Captain Dick Truly has never been in space, though he does have 6,000 hours of jet flying time.
I'd just like to say the Columbia's ready, and Joe and I are more than ready, and we really appreciate all y'all coming out this afternoon to greet us. We're all set to go, and I couldn't thank you anymore. We're glad to see you. Thanks a lot.
Meanwhile, what worries Mission Control the most is the weather. Tomorrow looks unsettled, and after tomorrow, the forecast is not good. Ultimately, whether or not man's most sophisticated flying machine flies again might depend on whether or not it rains. John Suchet, News at 10, at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida.
Right, well, let's go back to Martin Bell now in Cape Canaveral to see if he's got any more news on the takeoff. Martin?
Yes, the hold period is now over. We are
19, 18 and counting. The news still isn't good as far as the weather is concerned. No decision has yet been made. Commander John Young, the commander of the previous shuttle mission, is up aloft at the moment in a Gulfstream jet trainer, looking to see if he can find a hole through the clouds. And the decision to go might very well be a pilot's decision based on what he reports back. At the same time, there has been a problem closing out the clean room. There's a problem with a cork in the thermal protection system. They think they can solve that. What they don't know they can do anything about is the weather, and really they have only a few minutes in which to make up their minds about that.
Okay, a critical few minutes there. Martin, we'll be back as soon as we can. Well, now we are, in fact, getting pictures, live pictures from Cape Canaveral. So we'll now go over to Martin Bell once again. Martin, first of all, before we talk about potential hazards in the flight, is there going to be a flight, in fact? Because I think John Young was airborne in a Gulfstream looking at the weather conditions last time you spoke to us. Has he been able to report back yet?
If he has, the news he's given has not yet been passed on to us. They are now in what is, if there is a launch at half-past, in their final hold period, which lasts for 10 minutes. And this is the last chance that they have, really, to discuss the weather together, and if they're going for launch, to decide to do it. Because once that 9-minute final countdown starts, then everything is locked into a computerized sequence, and they'll be disinclined to recall it. It's rather a tense situation here, because they're not supposed by the book to launch if there's more than 50% cloud cover, and there's much more than 50% cloud cover at the moment. We are still waiting for the decision to be made. It has to be made within the next few minutes.
Well, while we wait for that decision, has there been any concern expressed about these heat-proof tiles which caused problems during the last flight?
Not at all, or very little. The greater number of those tiles, they survived much more stress than was expected. Only about a dozen came off. It is not now a main anxiety here. I repeat, the only anxiety is about the weather. The NASA people are supremely confident of their flying machine and its systems.
The shock waves still seem to cause a problem, although you say they're not worried about it now, because it too was blamed for some of the tiles falling off, and I believe they've taken some rather novel precautions, haven't they, this time, with water and things?
Yes, there's going to be much more water cascading now down on the pad at liftoff to try and minimize the amount of the shock waves and the stress. They're confident this is going to work. The bird has flown once, the bird will fly again. If only they can find a break in the clouds. And I repeat, that is really all that anyone's worrying about here at the moment.
Martin Bell, thank you. We'll be back with you shortly. In the meantime, well, so much for the Russians. Meanwhile, at Cape Canaveral, the blast-off is getting very close indeed. So let's now go straight over to Martin Bell at the Kennedy Space Center. Martin.
Yes, we have some news. This place is alive with excitement, notwithstanding the weather, the cloud cover, and the rain. It's now actually drizzling on us. The launch director has decided to go for launch. At the moment, we are still in the last hold at T-9. We are about to go down to the final countdown. We're 20 seconds from that. The launch director has spoken to the two men on board, has wished them a good flight, and it looks now that nothing, not even the weather, is going to stop the Columbia from getting airborne again.
That sounds a little surprising, because you said they usually didn't launch if there was a 50% cloud cover.
That's what the book says. They are aware, however, that the weather is only going to get worse during the day, and indeed they expect it to get worse during the week. The fact that they are willing to defy the rules of the book, in a sense, is a sign of their confidence in the machine that they've devised.
Fine. Is there any information we could get from Mission Control if we go into them now?
Most of the sequences now are on automatic. If you do hear a voice, it will most likely be the voice of Hugh Harris, NASA's spokesman, who is only 2 seats away from the launch director, George Page, and in the best possible position to know what's going on.
Fine. Well, Martin, while we're waiting, perhaps Christopher Wayne would like to push in 1 or 2 questions.
Heard from here that the hold clock is in fact holding. It should have continued the count, but they've said that it's now holding. I wonder if you have any information on why that is.
It is still holding. We're trying to find out now, and I think that Hugh Harris is going to explain it to us. But the hold is definitely being maintained.
Do you think it's possibly the weather, Martin?
Can you wait a minute?
1 pound per square inch below the launch commit criteria, and the recommendation is that we go. We're standing by now to hear when we might be able to recycle to start the countdown clock once again. At the time that they pick up at the T-minus 9-minute point, the event will be controlled by the ground launch sequencer from then up to about T-minus 31 seconds when they'll switch to the onboard redundant set launch sequencer.
I think that gives you the answer you wanted. There is a problem with oxygen pressure, not a severe one, and they are intending to go ahead nonetheless, but the clock has not yet been restarted.
Martin, thank you very much indeed. I gather it's about 9 minutes, is it now, to blast off?
We're on a 9-minute hold, but it's not a real 9 minutes until that clock starts to run again.
I see. Well, perhaps we can come back to you shortly.
Well, let's stick now with NASA Launch Control at the Kennedy Space Center as we enter the last few moments, the last minute and a half before launch of Space Shuttle 2.
Okay, be advised, oxygen tank 2 is now 1 psi below. Copy, TB. Right, we copy. I copy.
MTD Houston. Norm, we have to ask you all to speak up. We're having a terrible time here in the comm. They're very low.
Okay, how do you copy me now?
Slightly better, but everybody on the loop's low. It's not just you.
Are you on Big Well?
Yes, sir.
What's that mean, Dave?
It's a communications problem. The people in Houston are having trouble hearing all the communications at the Cape.
That's mission control, can't hear launch control.
That's correct.
Now, George, this is the EP flight mass indicator, which is a measurement that we send back and forth between the integration console and the main prop console.
They're holding the countdown clock, Dave. Would that be to sort this problem out?
No, I think the hold is for the weather, but it's really not clear to me why, because we missed that last call from the Cape.
1 to 3 psi below the lower limit control pressure.
No, it still has not. We're still waiting for it to be resumed. Launch control has been explaining to the crew of the Columbia what the problem was. We still have every reason to suppose that the count is going to be resumed, but it hasn't been resumed yet, and we're waiting to hear from Hugh Harris, the voice of NASA, in there in the control room, exactly what they're going to do.
I mean, is there a chance that they could change their minds even now and call it off?
Yes, of course, they can. They are not committed. I mean, they're not committed for some minutes yet. But we get a sense that they are determined to go through with this. The problems they have are minor problems and shouldn't stop the launch, though they might already have, in fact, delayed it.
Yes, those of us listening are particularly laymen like myself are perhaps a little confused by these holds that you get. Now, when this hold is lifted, how much of the countdown is left?
We have 9 minutes left. They can continue this hold indefinitely as long as the launch window lasts, if they wish to. But once that clock starts again, then it means that liftoff will be in 9 minutes, and everything is in a very tightly controlled and computerized sequence up to blastoff.
What is the atmosphere like there amongst those of you watching it on the site, so to speak?
There's a lot of excitement. There was cheering and clapping when it was announced that they would go for launch, because simply the weather had seemed so bad that I think most people were resigned to the idea that they wouldn't. On top of that now, I think we're having a little anxiety as the minutes tick away and the unexplained length of the delay persists. But most people, I think, feel we are going to go for launch. There's a big crowd out here and hoping to get it really within a matter of minutes.
This must, of course, have some sort of effect on the crew, or are they too busy to worry about delays like this?
They are among the most highly trained astronauts who've ever flown. Engel has been an astronaut for 26 years. They are trained to expect this kind of thing. And, of course, their predecessors suffered much worse, having to abandon the first attempt and come back 2 days later.
We've been expressing a lot of surprise and indeed admiration at the age of these two astronauts, indeed the age of a good many astronauts. They all seem to be sort of late 40s, early 50s. Do the Americans seem surprised by this, or do they take it for granted?
I wonder if you'd excuse me if we just listen to the voice of Hugh Harris. He might tell us what's going on.
Yeah. We'll wait to hear from you, Martin.
The oxidizer tank on the external tank was slightly below specifications, which is what stopped the clock originally. Then it was, once the clock had stopped, it was also determined that the pressure in the three tanks which supply liquid oxygen to the fuel cells was just slightly below specs also. In the meantime, the flight mass of liquid oxygen has been brought up to the proper level, and there has been a go given for the three liquid oxygen tanks used to support the fuel cells. Those fuel cells, by the way, assume the full weight of the electrical load of the orbiter about the T-minus 15-minute point, and so are using some of that liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen at the present time. George Page is in the process of talking to the engineers to get a better understanding of it, to ensure that there is nothing that would go wrong after we pass the T-minus 5-minute point. The T-minus 5-minute point is particularly critical because it's at that point that we start the auxiliary power units, which supply hydraulic power to the aero surfaces and for gimbling the engines on the orbiter. Once those are started, then we have only approximately 7 or 8 minutes in which to launch, or we would have to recycle and cool them down before picking it up. At this point in the count, however, we have approximately 90 minutes in which we are able to stay in the hold. So although we have a go for the various conditions, we are having a discussion of what the implications of them are for later in the countdown. This is shuttle launch control.
Okay, thank you.
ALPS OTC. KRBS verified 798. Okay, C1TC. Verified 799. Verified. Away, if we get auto sequence. Affirmative, we did. This is shuttle launch control at T-minus 8 minutes, 29 seconds, and counting. We had a determination that the interpretation of some of the values on the liquid oxygen tanks for the fuel cells were probably not interpreted correctly, and we were in a go condition, and we got a buy-off from the various managers here and at Houston to go ahead with the countdown. Coming up T-minus 8 minutes and counting. The launch events are being controlled by the ground launch sequencer from now up to the T-minus 31 second point, where they will switch to the onboard redundant set launch sequencer. The ground launch sequencer is part of the launch processing system and operates by relaying commands to the orbiter's onboard computers, which then report back to the launch processing system that the commands have been executed. The primary job of the computers is to check all of the launch commit criteria. T-minus 7 minutes, 25 seconds, and counting. The cabin
so there you have it. The hold is over. Into the final sequence of countdown for the launch at last. So it looks as if that problem wasn't as great as anything that could hold it on the ground for the 90 minutes which they can stick around for in this particular sequence.
And we have start of the retraction of the access arm at the 195-foot level of the fixed service structure.
They're pulling the gantry away now, Dave.
Yes, they're pulling the white room away, and the crew is now alone in the cabin.
They waited a long time, those boys, for this flight.
Yes, they have. I think each of them has waited about 15 years, which means 30 years total, but we'll find when they get back, they'll say it was worth it.
T-minus 4 minutes, 25 seconds, and counting. The APU's start has been named complete by pilot Dick Truly. Coming up on the 4-minute point in our countdown. T-minus 4 minutes and counting. T-minus 3 minutes, 45 seconds and counting. The Elevon speed brake and rudder are being moved through a pre-programmed pattern to assure that they'll be ready for use in flight. T-minus 3 minutes, 30 seconds and counting. The shuttle is now on internal power. However, the fuel cells producing the normal needed power in the orbiter. T-minus 3 minutes, 12 seconds and counting. The profile checks of the aero surfaces have been completed and checked. T-minus 3 minutes and counting. The engine gimbal or movement check is underway to assure they're ready for flight control. The liquid oxygen valve on the external tank has been closed and pressurization begun. After the tank is pressurized, the hold capability is limited to somewhere between up to about 5 minutes. T-minus 2 minutes, 30 seconds. Mark and counting. The fuel cell ground supply of oxygen to the hydrogen have been terminated. T-minus 2 minutes, 15 seconds. The pressure in the liquid oxygen tank is at flight pressure. Coming up on the 2-minute point, T-minus 2 minutes and counting. T-minus 1 minute, 55 seconds. The liquid hydrogen vent valve has been closed and flight pressurization is underway. T-minus 1 minute, 40 seconds and counting. T-minus 1 minute, 30 seconds and counting. T-minus 1 minute, 17 seconds and counting. The liquid hydrogen tank is at flight pressurization. Coming up on the 1-minute point in our countdown. T-minus 1 minute and counting. T-minus 50 seconds and counting. Coming up on 40 seconds, T-minus 40 seconds. The development flight instrument recorders are on. T-minus 35 seconds. We're just a few seconds away from switching control to the computer sequencer in the orbiter. T-minus 31 seconds, and we have held at the T-minus 31 second point. Evaluation is being made as to why the countdown has held at the T-minus 31 second point. We believe that it is because the tanks on the fuel cells pressure is not cleared with the redundant set sequencer.
This is a very late
recommendation to continue. We're ready to pick up the clock. We're ready to 2-1, T-minus 31 seconds. the clock did not resume.
So we have a hold now. Martin, this, as you said just now, is a very late hold.
Test conductor Norm
It's a very late
Carlson
hold.
asked
From
for a
what Q Harris
determination
is
of why the
saying, it
clock did
sounds
not
as
pick
if
up.
it might be a very short hold. There might even be a problem with the clock. We're just waiting to find out.
Time is very critical
Right,
at this
in our
point
London studio,
because
Geoffrey
the
Pardo, have
auxiliary
you got any
power
comment to
units
make
are
on this very
underway.
late hold?
Yes, it's about 2 or 3 seconds before it becomes very critical indeed. I don't think there's a serious problem here. I think it's a question possibly of instrumentation, the timing, the clocks. These, of course, are fundamental tanks down in the base of the actual orbiter vehicle itself, which provide basically the energy for the fuel cells, which provides all the electricity. They have to have it right to go. But it's not unusual to have just a small variation in sensors and instrumentation this time. I hope it's just that.
Geoffrey, I've just heard them saying that they can hold for about 1 minute 20 seconds at this.
We did not have a resume of the clock and have had an indication that we have a possible problem with the software. It appears we are going to have to recycle. Now, it doesn't look like we've got a good handle on it. Launch Director George Page has just recommended that we go into our scrub turnaround procedure. The clock has stopped at the T-minus 31 second point, and a determination will be made as to why that occurred. The crew is in the process of turning around and going back to an appropriate hold time.
That doesn't mean, Dave, that it's scrubbed for today.
We have a go for APU shutdown. The auxiliary power units are being shut down at the present time.
That does.
This is the major time constraint which we have when we get into the last 5 minutes of the countdown. We have the capability with the fuel on board for the APUs to have one more attempt today. If we should not succeed once we have started those APUs again, then we would have to scrub for at least 48 hours because we have put the cryogenic propellants in the external tank.
And the launch window is 4 hours, 30 minutes.
At the present time, however, no determination has been made as to precisely where we are recycling to or whether we will be able to get the clock started once again. We are going back to the T-minus 9 minute point in the countdown at this particular point.
Understand off? Off. Okay, APU controller power is 3. I'm going OFF off. Roger. Hydraulic main pump press all 3 to norm.
That's Dick Truly responding to the launch control, the launch countdown conductor, in setting the switches inside the cockpit of the vehicle so that they can recycle.
Pilot Dick Truly has been asked to open his visor, and he and Angle process of reconfiguring the switches inside the orbiter for a return to the T-minus 9 minute point in our countdown.
You're ahead of them, Dave.
Well, I've been there a couple of times.
We have had a report that the reconfiguration of the switches in the cockpit has been completed for a recycle to the T-minus 9 minute point in our countdown.
So, one more stab at getting this thing into the air. What's John Suchet thinking at the Cape?
Well, Peter, you can imagine the disappointment here. Hardened cameramen who have come from all over the world shaking their heads in despair. 31 seconds. It was so close they can hardly believe it. However, you never know. There may be a silver lining in the cloud, literally. It's rotten weather, thick clouds up there. By the time this thing finally gets off, who knows, we might get a brilliantly bright and blue, sunny Florida day. There's at least that to hope for. Back to you.
Of sophisticated machinery, otherwise known as the Space Shuttle, stand idle on the launch pad, victim of what became literally a last-minute hold-up. The Columbia craft was just 31 seconds from the start of its historic journey when the launch computers stopped the countdown clock. The problem, oil pressure in the fuel tank was too high. Now all the fuel, 500,000 gallons of it, is being drained, and that takes time. So it'll be Friday afternoon at the earliest before they can try again. Today, though, they were so confident, as our correspondent Martin Bell reports.
Early morning at the Cape, the Columbia seemed to be towards the end of one of the smoothest of countdowns. The astronauts, Joe Engle and Dick Truly, were going through the familiar pre-flight routines. The breakfast of steak and eggs, afterwards the walk to the suiting room, the final checks of equipment and procedures. The countdown had been so trouble-free there was little doubt they'd be on their way into orbit, weather permitting.
At the present time, the astronaut crew on its way up the slope to the pad surface, the elevators being brought into position to receive them, where they will go up to the White Room at the 195-foot level.
At that time, it seemed the only doubt was about the weather, cloudy skies and crosswinds, difficult conditions for a return to the landing site in case of an emergency. John Young, commander of the previous mission, went up in the training aircraft to look for a hole in the clouds, and his report was favorable. They could go for launch.
We are go. PLT is go. LRD is go.
The final countdown was on. The so-called beanie cap was withdrawn from the top of the external tank. Columbia was within less than a minute of liftoff.
T-minus 40 seconds. The development flight instrument recorders are on. T-minus 35 seconds. We're just a few seconds away from switching control to the computer sequencer in the orbiter. T-minus 31 seconds. And we have held at the T-minus 31 second point.
The problem identified by the control room was high pressure of lubricating oil in the auxiliary power units, and the Columbia's computers wouldn't take instructions to ignore it.
Launch Director George Page has determined that we will scrub the launch for today.
The postponement was a disappointment for the crowds of guests invited to the Kennedy Space Center. Actor Robert Redford was just one of them. But the greatest disappointment of all, of course, was for the two astronauts themselves. 5 hours cooped up in the spacecraft, and they never got off the ground. The shortest possible delay before launch now is 48 hours, and it could be longer than that. In the end, the Columbia, as a second-hand spacecraft, behaved the same as the Columbia when she was new. Just didn't want to go first time. Martin Bell, BBC, Cape Canaveral.
Well, Newsround space editor Reg Turnell is still at launch control at Cape Canaveral, and I hope he's on the phone to us now. Good morning, Reg. Are you there?
Good morning, John.
Hello. What is the latest news?
Well, it's a bit more promising now because there's one more test, the flushing of the oil that was mentioned in that piece, and if that goes well later today, it's hoped that it'll be possible to pick up the count at T-minus 35 hours on Tuesday and launch on Thursday. That's not quite certain, but that's what we hope.
And if it is launched on Thursday, will it be again at lunchtime as it was supposed to be in last week?
Yes, about the same time, about 12:30.
Well, it must be a very nail-biting time for everybody, for the space team, for the astronauts, and of course for people like yourself who are still having to wait there. Are many people still waiting, many reporters?
Well, no, most people have gone home. Even a lot of the newsmen have gone, except for those of us like myself who've come thousands of miles. There's nothing we can do except wait. I think perhaps the most embarrassed man, John, is a businessman, American businessman, who spent £75,000 of his own money bringing 66 teenagers from 22 different Latin American and Caribbean countries to see the launch. He did that because he discovered that their teachers, who'd apparently been trained in Cuba, had been telling children in these countries that the American space program didn't really exist, that it was all faked with models from Hollywood. And so, of course, he brought these children to see the launch, which didn't go off.
So they've still got to wait before they believe?
Yes, he's trying to keep them busy with trips to mission control and things like that.
Well, let's hope they do believe it next week, Reg. Thank you very much indeed. But what time is it, by the way, in America?
It's just after 5 a.m. here, and very